Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Simplify life with diabetes. By Dexcom, take control of your diabetes and live life with the fullest with Dexcom. And by Club 1921, where diabetes connections are made.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, there's been a lot of excitement recently about stem cell transplants and progress toward using this as a functional cure for type 1. There are a few separate groups working on this. We're going to get past the hype and look at the real progress here.
We're not there yet, where there's research still being done, but it's probably at this time the most promising it's ever been. And that's also important to stay realistic, because I want to give hope to patients, but also want to give them a sense of reality of the timeline that it may take. But we're so close.
That's ViaCyte's head of clinical development, Dr. Manasi Jaiman. ViaCyte has been studying stem cell transplants for years and recently started working with the gene editing technology CRISPR. We're going to talk about what this is really all about, how close they are, and who would be in line to benefit. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm always so glad to have you here. As you know, we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. This week's interview is all about a subject which, I gotta say, gets covered, as we have seen recently, in the mainstream non-diabetes media outlets in a very, I don't want to say sensational way, but let's say in a more simplistic way. Write headlines like, "The cure is coming," or, "Is this a cure? It worked for this guy," that kind of stuff. It's also something that gets short-handed a lot. So before we jump into the interview, I just want to kind of explain a few concepts. Many of you know this and can skip right over it. But in case this is your first time listening to information about these stem cell transplants and gene editing and that kind of thing, I want to talk for just a moment about why it's so important, kind of how it works. So if you have type 1, the autoimmune system destroys the pancreas's beta cells. The beta cells are those cells that produce insulin. If you replace the destroyed beta cells with cells that make insulin and then protect them, the body uses the insulin made from those new cells in the same way it would use healthy cells that you were born with. I remember when Benny was diagnosed, my son, and this was back in 2006, we started hearing a lot about islet cell transplantation, using donor islets from cadavers, from dead bodies as a donor, right, as an organ donor. This worked for some people, but it wasn't really a practical approach because it didn't work for everyone. It didn't last in everyone. And it also required taking a lot of immunosuppressive medication, which some people say is harder on the body than having type 1 diabetes. And it also puts you at greater risk for many other complications and conditions. The next pathway seemed to be looking at stem cell research. Stem cells are like your body's raw material. They're the cells from which everything else, cells with specialized functions, are generated. So in a lab, they can take stem cells and make them heart cells or bone cells or beta cells. And that's what we're talking about here. There are three main companies working on this in separate ways. ViaCyte, who I'm talking to today, and you'll hear more about their plans. Vertex, which was the subject of that New York Times article that I think everybody sent to everybody last fall. The headline was "A Cure for Type 1 Diabetes for One Man." It seems to have worked. And Cernova, their cell replacement therapy is the cell pouch system. Right now, all of these methods are in very small clinical trials. They all require immunosuppressive drugs to keep the body from attacking and killing the stem cells. And as you'll hear, that is what ViaCyte is hoping to avoid by working with the CRISPR technology. I am not sure how to explain CRISPR quickly. It is a way to alter the DNA of a cell. And I will link up a lot more information on that. I've watched 3 or 4 documentaries on it. It is absolutely fascinating, and it has implications for far more than diabetes. So my guest is Dr. Manasi Jaiman, ViaCyte's head of clinical development. Dr. Jaiman has been an attending physician at Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts General Hospital. She's been in clinical care. As you'll hear her, she talks about being a pediatric endocrinologist. And she was a co-investigator for the bionic pancreas trials years ago at Massachusetts General. I think she does a terrific job of taking us on the line between hope and hype of this really incredible technology that I believe is going to be a reality. All right, but first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. When you're deciding on a brand of insulin pump, there are a lot of things to think about, especially if you've never used a pump before. It can seem overwhelming. There are a lot of choices, and you want to make the right decision. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about the Omnipod Dash free trial. Curious about trying an insulin pump or seeing what life without tubes is all about? You can now try Omnipod Dash free for 30 days. The trial comes with no commitment or obligation. Not right for you? No problem. Terms and conditions apply. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, also visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Dr. Jaiman, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for spending some of your valuable time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
There's so much to talk about, and my listeners have a lot of questions. Why don't we just jump right in and start by talking about what it is we're talking about here? I know there are a couple of iterations, but kind of zoom back and tell me what the goal is for ViaCyte.
Sure, absolutely. Well, the goal for this company really is to find and develop a functional cure for type 1 diabetes. We've been the first in this space, and we continue to forge forward.
And I hate to even ask this, but what does that really mean?
So it really means that what we're trying to develop is a way for patients to not have the burden of giving insulin and administering insulin. It's basically, we're trying to make cells that the pancreas has, implant those, and allow the patient's body to take control.
The last time I talked about ViaCyte on the show, and I should note that at the time, we actually didn't talk to the folks, we didn't talk to you all from ViaCyte. I was talking to a group that was making a movie about it. But the last time that we talked about it here on the show, this was all about encapsulation, which I know is still being studied. There are alternatives to it as well that you're looking at. But can you talk a little bit about what encapsulation is?
You know, when I think about encapsulation, I actually think about our cells going into a device. So it's encapsulated within a device. Now, there's different variations of what encapsulation can include, which it can be where vessels directly go into the device through small perforations or very tiny holes outside of the device on the membrane that really allow access of the cells to oxygen and nutrients while still allowing insulin and glucagon to leave the cell, so other hormones.
How does it work? I mean, it looked to me like there was this flat thing. I mean, it was kind of cylindrical. Yeah. It kind of surgically put that in the body?
Exactly. So our devices are about the size of a credit card and actually thinner than that. And they are implanted subcutaneously, so just under the skin in the body. And they have cells that respond to blood glucose levels, high or low. They're stem cells that we have developed that actually follow the lineage of a beta cell. So as you know, with patients with type 1 diabetes, there's beta cell destruction and alpha cell dysfunction. And what does that mean? So beta cells make insulin that makes your blood sugar go down. Alpha cells makes glucagon that brings your blood glucose up. Those are both absolutely required to have steady blood glucose levels. And what we are working on and developing is an alternate to what our body already has, beta cells, alpha cells. Our cells actually develop into those and then start doing the work that the pancreas did.
Implanting those stem cells with the encapsulation around it, does that mean that the person no longer would need immunosuppressive drugs or things we've seen elsewhere?
So actually, that's a great question. And that's absolutely what we're working towards. Now, currently, regardless of who's working on this, everyone needs to be on immunosuppression. And that's really to allow to see proof of concept that these cells can work and actually do what we've designed them to do. The next iteration is to really make these cells immune evasive or cloak them from our immune response in the body.
So forgive my ignorance. I thought the encapsulation was supposed to do that.
So, when I'm telling you that there's direct, first I talked about there's holes on the outside of the device. So that allows blood vessels from our body to integrate into the device and supply nutrients, oxygen. However, it also brings immune fighting cells into that space. And with this iteration, you absolutely still do need immunosuppression. However, we are working on our next iteration, which really involves these cells being cloaked from the body's immune defense system.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
When you say, cloaked, what does that mean?
So Essentially, what we're working on right now with our collaboration with CRISPR Therapeutics and their gene editing technology is combining that with our proprietary stem cell capabilities and really making the cells edited in such a way that the body doesn't recognize them as foreign. So whenever we have an example, and a very mild example is, say you get a splinter and you start immediately seeing inflammation in that area, correct? And the body's really attacking it to get rid of it. What we're trying to do is have our implant in a patient without having that same sort of response.
I'm trying to recall, and maybe you can, something that, CRISPR is just absolutely amazing. And we've seen it, there's documentaries and things. I'm trying to remember where people might have seen it. That's why I'm kind of pausing here.
Well, they've been in the gene editing space for several years, and they've made forward momentum outside of type 1 diabetes. You may have seen them in some capacity with blood disease and genetic changes to the cells that they've been working on those. And I think that what they've done is forged the way in their space. And I can't tell you how thrilled we are to be the first to be able to work on a platform that can actually take immunosuppression out of the equation.
It's really incredible when I think about the times that I've seen CRISPR, in documentaries or wherever it's been talked about. It really seems like it just changes the game in a way that we haven't been able to before. So again, we're early on in this.
Yes.
And not to be too repetitive, but just to be clear, the idea then is that you would take the actual process of ViaCyte still, in other words, the encapsulation, the stem cells that you use, but by partnering with CRISPR, you'd be able to really kind of change the way the body would recognize those stem cells. In other words, they wouldn't be, targeted for that destruction.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So it's our cells have gone through the process through CRISPR's technology and then implanted, and they're cloaked. They're cloaked from that immune response.
It just boggles the mind.
Yes.
I mean, how does something like that look? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, does it look any different, or is it functionally any different once they've edited those cells, how you then would surgically put them in the person? In other words, does anything in that process change?
No, absolutely not. It literally is only a forward movement forward. We implant them subcutaneously, as I mentioned, just under the skin, usually in around the stomach, abdomen area. And that process has not changed and will not change.
It's so interesting. So again, not to be too optimistic, but that this procedure works, right? You've done all the clinical trials that show
Absolutely.
that a beta cell can be transplanted.
Well, what I can share with you is really what we presented at the American Diabetes Association last year in 2021. And we presented a patient who was in one of our studies using a similar device that we're now collaborating with CRISPR. And those results were so significant. And I can tell you, as a pediatric endocrinologist, to see that really gave me hope of what we really need to achieve for all patients with type 1 diabetes. This patient was implanted with our devices and at 39 weeks had C-peptide being a marker of endogenous insulin production, so what your body's making inherently, and that was 0.8 nanograms per ml. And that number really signifies it's an important amount of C-peptide that's produced. A normal is anywhere from 0.5 to about 2 nanograms per ml. With someone who does not have type 1 diabetes, that's the range you would expect. So we've reached kind of within a limit where you'd actually see some changes in insulin production and then how that affects glycemic control. And I can tell you this patient's time in range, which is from CGM data that we've been able to get, improved into the 80th percentile. And American Diabetes Association says that you should be at least 70% of the time in that range. And we achieved beyond that with this patient. Her insulin dosing also dropped by over 70%.
Do you know, and maybe you said this, do you know how long she had been living with diabetes, with type 1?
36 years.
Well, that's very significant.
36 years, absolutely. And when we saw those results, and we were so thrilled to present it because, it's the road to the cure. And we have to walk that road, and we're doing everything we can in research to make this happen, but we're getting one step closer at a time.
I think this question's a little off topic, but I am curious. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of thinking years ago that someone who lived with diabetes for that long could not produce their own insulin anymore, right? That it was just dead. It was not able to restart. Does this show otherwise, and other studies have shown otherwise?
No, it's true. So over time, you do have beta cell destruction, and usually you reach a threshold or even if you had residual beta cells left that may produce C-peptide, it's not enough. And each individual is different depending on obviously length of diabetes, duration, and individual differences in the amount of beta cells impacted. What I will say is someone with 36 years of type 1 diabetes likely will not ever make enough to matter for blood glucose control. And what's exciting about therapies in the regenerative space, specifically in stem cell therapy that we're working on, it's infinite number of cells available to do that and replace that function that you've lost for this many years.
Yeah. I was kind of asking the wrong question there. I realized as you were answering, it wasn't so much can you restart, is can you accept new?
You can accept new, but here's the thing. Your immune system still wants to fight off foreign bodies. And so that's why immunosuppression is still there to help make sure that there's no attack to these cells to allow them to work. Now, I think the next step that's very important is to find a way to make sure that they don't have a response against the immune system, which is the gene cloaking that I was mentioning earlier with CRISPR.
Where are you on this partnership? Is it research stage? Are there clinical trials? Can you share at all where the ViaCyte CRISPR actually kind of getting to patient stuff is?
Absolutely. So what's publicly shared at this time is that we actually had our first patient dosed earlier this year in a safety study that was started. And so we have, in fact, started our patient clinical trials.
I have to ask then, because I know I'm going to get this question, is how can people get into these trials?
I am always amazed by this community. I think the enthusiasm and the will to drive research forward it always blows me away. And I really want to give every person a chance to be able to participate. What I will say right now is, there is always clinicaltrials.gov as a website to go to see where we are with our sites. Also, if you live close to a site, call them. The numbers are available on there as far as the coordinators to reach and get on the list. As you can tell, these studies are quite small because it's in the inception phases, at least with our collaboration with CRISPR. And if you want to be a part of those studies, it's important to understand it's a small group of people that are allowed to be in it because we want to do it in the safest fashion forward. I do not want to put patient safety at risk, and we want to make sure that every step we take is in recognition of that because patient safety is a priority for us. And so what I would recommend is go on that website, connect with those coordinators if they're close to you. Keep an eye out because we will add new sites to that website as we have more information. Also, please check out our website because we usually update any other endeavors that are now publicly available frequently on that site.
I have a lot more questions, but I wanted to get to two questions from my listeners that I thought were really interesting. One of my listeners asked if you were relying solely on encapsulation to contain the immune-resistant cells. And then what would happen if those cells they wrote, escape the encapsulation device and start growing outside? What could happen, or could that happen?
Well, that's a really great question. And honestly, that's something that each step of the way we want to ensure does not happen. Again, patient safety is our utmost priority. And even through preclinical studies, before we've gone into patients, we've made sure that actually does not happen. And so far, in all of the studies we've had through the few years that we've been in clinic, we've never seen that. We've never seen cells escape, and we continue to monitor that, but we absolutely do not anticipate that happening.
If something does go wrong, I don't know, with the encapsulation device or with the person, can these be removed? Can you just take the container out?
Absolutely. That's one of the safest parts of having an encapsulation device within stem cell therapy is the fact that not can you only implant them, but you could explant them as soon as you need to.
Do you call it the encapsulation device? Does it have a different name? Is it like the capsule, or are we calling it the right thing?
So the terminology we use is dose finding units, which is too scientific. I would say large unit is probably sufficient in the space. Large unit that holds stem cells. And I hope we have some savvy name that we come out with.
I was going to say, large unit that holds stem cells. We can help you with that.
I know. I mean, we're going to rely on the community to really help us with the nomenclature eventually.
I shouldn't laugh, but that's pretty funny. We can definitely have a naming contest and then help you out.
I would love that.
Another question that came through, and this is more serious. And I'm going to read it because I'm not sure that I can. It certainly is not something that I thought of. So let me just read it out. Immune-evasive therapies that don't require chronic immunosuppression sound fantastic, but I've noticed a lot of CRISPR-edited therapies purposely use cancer-like qualities to avoid detection/destruction by the immune system and to allow cell proliferation. There has been research that show instances of mutations, possibly putting recipients at increased risk of developing cancer. Is there anything to something like that? And are the stem cell lines monitored?
Wow, that is an excellent question. I will bring it back to the patient safety that I mentioned earlier. That is always and will be our priority. And because of that, we've done multiple evaluations and testing, rigorous testing and characterization of the editing methods that we have in place, both at ViaCyte and CRISPR, and we have not seen this whatsoever. We will continue to monitor closely, but this is not a concern for us at this time. And we remain confident that this approach will work and will not be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to harp on it, but I know that as people were listening and heard the word cancer,
yes,
right, that sounds very scary. Like, what is it about this thing? It uses cancer-like qualities. I assume that the person means, and the thinking there is that we're talking about wanting cells to proliferate, and cancer is always an overproliferation of cells. So that's that. I'm interpreting the question I've just asked, but that's what's meant by that.
No, and that's exactly how I received that as well. And I think what's important, again, to understand is that these are questions that even before the development stages and preclinical studies that was outlined and studied rigorously before we even imagined putting it in patients.
This has been a really interesting couple of months in this space. Late last year, I think everybody I know got the New York Times article on a different company, on Vertex, emailed to them where, the headline was "A cure for type 1 diabetes?" ? For one man, it seemed to have worked. And this is all about their stem cell line and one patient and success. Do you mind talking a little bit about the differences between the two systems?
Oh, absolutely. So, and I know a lot of people have probably read about this as well, but Vertex's line is basically infused directly into the portal vein, so liver, essentially. There's no encapsulation. I want to also say that, I also read that article, I've seen the news, and we support this mission, specifically generating insulin freedom for patients. That's priority. And it's so exciting that news created so much insight into the space, specifically in regenerative medicine and stem cell fields in general. And I think most importantly, what I would like to say about that is that they support ViaCyte's approach that includes portal vein delivery, which is what they did, immune-evasive cells as well, and any other delivery systems, especially what we're working on. And what's also important is that these findings that they had from their research really shows that portal vein delivery systems of some cells works. And that's even while they utilize chronic immunosuppression, it's in line with the efforts that were done by Dr. Shapiro over 20 years ago through the Edmonton Protocol. So as you recall, cadaveric islet cell transplants, that's the protocol that he developed in the early 2000s. And that also led to insulin freedom under chronic immunosuppression through portal vein delivery. So it's exciting that they were able to show that their cells do what was already done in the space in an innovative way. It's put a lot of attention in the space that's needed, and that allows for education for the general public and patients.
I don't usually ask companies to comment on other companies' lines or products, but I thought it was worth asking about just because of the similarities and the differences there.
Absolutely. And, I will say as a physician who has patients with type 1 diabetes, what's the most important is that we get this to them. Each company, regardless which company, is working towards that. And I'm proud to be part of one of those companies.
Let me ask you, as an endocrinologist, when people see headlines like "A cure for type 1 diabetes?" And then you see all of the follow-ups on it with copycat headlines and, could this be a cure? I have such mixed feelings now as somebody who's been in the space. My son was diagnosed more than 15 years ago. I have such mixed feelings because I know what's behind that headline. And then, as I said, everybody sends it to you, right? It's like, look at this. This is amazing. Yes. And you're like, well, maybe someday. What do you think? Do you think it is a good thing for the work you're doing? Let me start there. To see these headlines and this excitement that's out there right now?
I think there is a fine line between hope and overpromising. And for me, as a pediatric endocrinologist, and trust me, I've had these questions even before I was at ViaCyte, all the time about any new therapy that was out there. And is it going to make things better? Is it going to make life better? And I guess my answer to you is that it's important to get some attention in this field because it is very important. It's the next iteration of paradigm shift in how we treat type 1 diabetes. However, I think it's important to also recognize it's a road and it's a journey. And we're working as fast as we can. And there's multiple companies within the space working as fast as they can. And as long as we recognize it's a road and we're not there yet, where there's research still being done, but it's probably at this time the most promising it's ever been. And that's also important to stay realistic because I want to give hope to patients, but also want to give them a sense of reality of the timeline that it may take. But we're so close and we're getting there. We're going to get there sooner than we did even 5 years ago. And I guess that's where I would leave it.
Tell me about your time as a pediatric endocrinologist. Why did you get into all of this?
Great question. And it really stems from a personal history in the family with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I was exposed to that young at my family, and I immediately became interested in the physiology. But then I realized how the burden that truly was part of being diagnosed specifically with type 1 diabetes. That really actually led me into medicine, which led me into pediatrics. And then that led me to endocrinology. And while I trained, I was at Mass General Hospital, and I knew what I wanted to work on, wanted to be in the innovative side of treatment. And that's where I worked on the bionic pancreas trials there. And I saw how meaningful that work was and what we could do from the technological side. And as I worked on that, I developed a deeper passion and understanding and the empathy that followed seeing patients every single day, having to live minute by minute on a therapy. I wanted to change that. And that drove me to ViaSite. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else and doing anything else than working on this to make that burden go away for patients.
I'm curious, when you said the bionic pancreas, where were you working with that?
I started that research when I was a fellow, and I wrote one of the first pediatric outpatient protocols there. So very, very early on, before even the phase 2 trials that started. So early inception, kind of when they were trying to prove that it actually worked. Stephen Russell and Ed Damiano's work. Yeah, and I can tell you the mentorship through them, being a fellow and seeing the passion, especially with Ed and his history with his family, it just reinforced the need and the work that really needs to happen in the space. It is a closed loop system that they're working on, similar to what you've seen out with some of the other companies, Tandem, Medtronic. But I will say that, an important lesson I learned being part of that team was there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we have to bring this forward technologically through a functional cure. There is an immense need, and I'm glad that I was able to work with that team and see Ed's story with his family history of type 1 diabetes and the passion and the passion of the patients that were in that study and what it meant to them to have an opportunity to, even for a few hours, just forget about dosing.
One of the tough things about these methods, though, is that practically, even if they were to come out tomorrow and work really well, as a layperson, I'm assuming they would be pretty expensive and may not be available to everybody. I've already read that some of these would only be available, at least to start, for people who are really struggling. And I guess by that we mean everybody struggles, right? Type 1 diabetes is never a walk in the park. But, like the people who have huge issues with hypoglycemia and things like that. Is that correct?
So I guess what I will say is you kind of have to look back at islet cell transplant recipients. And so those patients initially had hypoglycemia unawareness. And it was the way from the regulatory standpoint to also really see the difference it made for a very vulnerable subset of patients who have type 1 diabetes. I will also say that I think we're too early to kind of consider how the payer aspect would be affected, but we are starting that work right now. And I will say, I know the cost of insulin. I know the cost of a hospitalization for DKA or a hypoglycemic event. And I think that the upfront cost, I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but is nowhere near what patients have to actually pay for their cost of healthcare, if any of those things happen.
Would the ultimate goal be for everybody? I mean, it's hard to imagine something like this for everybody, but it is the goal.
It is. The ultimate goal is all patients with type 1 diabetes as well as insulin requiring type 2 diabetes.
You mentioned a family member with diabetes. Do you mind if I ask who that was or what the story was there?
Sure. So I was a bit younger, and it was a cousin who was diagnosed in India. And the healthcare system is very different there. And they had a really hard time paying for insulin, access to insulin. And I remember when I was younger, I didn't really understand what that actually meant. And as I got older and went into medicine, I realized the immense burden and the complications associated with even just access. That you have a disease now that requires a life-saving therapy, and now you don't have access to that medicine. When I finally understood what that actually meant to my family, I knew I had to change it. I just had to be part of that process.
What should we be looking for in the next couple of years from ViaCyte and CRISPR? Are there trials that are starting? Are there kind of some goalposts that you'd like to hit that we can look for in the next year or two?
I think what I can share at this time is that after starting the study earlier this year, as we've disclosed, we're excited to see the results from the study. Mostly we're looking at safety and immune evasiveness, and that'll inform the rest of the next couple of years. I think for me, the most important thing is to educate patients, families, the general public about this space. There is attention that's being given to this space right now, which is great. But I think people really need to understand what it means. It takes years of research and development to get to where I consider ViaCyte is at, which is at the forefront and at the cusp of something amazing. And it's still going to take some time, and we're being very realistic about that as well. But the collaboration with CRISPR and being able to bring this forward is extremely exciting. It's extremely promising, and I hope that people continue to ask questions, engage. Feel free to ask us questions. We have a website. We have an info box you can ask. I think I want to encourage that first and foremost, because I think that education piece is missing in regenerative medicine. So I'm just thankful that you had me on so we could talk a little bit more about it and highlight the space.
Yeah. And just one more thing before I let you go. I'm curious, most pediatric endocrinologists that I know really care so much about their patients and the families that come into their office. And you were just seeing patients like a year ago. Do you keep them in your mind when you're working with ViaCyte? Are there these specific faces that you think about still?
Absolutely. Every single day. Every morning I wake up and I come to work, and we get drawn into the minutia of research, which you have to absolutely do. But then even with my team, I remind them every time I talk to them, remember who we're doing this for. These are real people. And imagine having a minute by minute disease that you have to kind of pay attention to at every single moment. We have to make a change for this, and we have to change it ourselves. And I think that drives the entire company. The passion is real. And I think what people really, the reason people are here is to drive that forward. So it's every day. Every day we're reminded who we're doing this for.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you coming on. I can't believe this is the first time that I've talked to somebody from ViaCyte. I hope it's not the last, and you'll keep us posted.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
As always, I will link up more information at diabetes-connections.com or in the show notes of wherever you are listening to this podcast. There is so much information here, and there's a lot to take in. I definitely urge you to check out more. I will be linking up the clinical trials that she mentioned. It's very difficult to get in, as she said. I've actually heard from many of you. I had talked about this interview in the Facebook group, in Diabetes Connections, the group, asking for questions. And a few people had said that they tried to get into the trials and they could not. And I get it. That's very frustrating. We've had terrible luck getting Benny into clinical trials. But sometimes they're just looking for, something very particular. It could be a location issue. There's so much that goes on here. But I really appreciate you trying to get into these trials because, and I hear this all the time from folks like Dr. Jaiman who say, the diabetes community is incredible when it comes to signing up and raising their hands and things like this. They have a lot of trouble in other health condition communities, I guess is the term. But in diabetes, they are turning people away, which is good for them, but not great for us. So thanks. All right, more to come in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. I want to talk for a minute about Control IQ, the Dexcom G6 tandem pump software program. When it comes to Benny's numbers, You know, I hardly expect perfection. I just want him happy and healthy. And I have to say, Control IQ, the software from Dexcom and Tandem, has exceeded my expectations. Benny is able to do less checking and less bolusing and is spending more time in range. He has just done so well. I mean, in a teenager, this is the time when I was really prepared for him to be struggling. And his sleep is better. With basal adjustments possible every 5 minutes, the system is working hard to keep him in range. And that means we hear far fewer Dexcom alerts, which means everybody is sleeping better. I am so grateful for this. Of course, individual results may vary. To learn more, just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. I got into the habit a couple of years ago of telling you where I was going here towards the end of the show. We got out of that habit because who went anywhere? But I'm going places again. We're tiptoeing out. We'll see what the spring and summer bring, fingers crossed. But our JDRF chapters here in North Carolina have started doing some outdoor meetups and events. So I'm excited about that. I'll be in Raleigh on April 2nd. I'll be in the Triad region, that is near Greensboro, in May. And if you're in the local area, I hope you can join me for that. Over in the summer, of course, we got Friends for Life in July in Orlando. And we'll see as they're putting more things on the calendar. I always like to do virtual events as well, if possible. So if your group has a need for a speaker, I would love to help out. On a personal note, just to keep you kind of posted on what's going on with us diabetes-wise in this house, Benny is going to be a CIT this summer at his regular camp. You know, that's not a diabetes camp, and he'll be gone for 8 weeks, which is the longest that he's gone. But I know it's going to be fine. And he has kind of a meeting weekend, like a retreat for the CITs coming up. So I'm excited for that. It's always good for him to go. He has no worries. He's always like, Mom, I've got it. But I like that he has kind of these warm-up events that give me practice before he's gone, you know, for the whole summer. And we are also looking at colleges. He's a junior in high school. So for those of you who've listened to the start of the show, when Benny was barely in middle school, oh my goodness, folks, this is crunch time for me. I'm really excited to see where he goes. We've been through this once before. I have an older daughter, so I like to think I'm less stressed this time around. And my job is just keeping him from getting stressed out. So I'll keep you posted. Thanks, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan at Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. We do have some great shows coming up in the next week or two. We're going to be talking to one of the Joslin medalists. These are the folks who have been diagnosed for more than 50 years, and they take part in this terrific program at Joslin where they not only have an opportunity to meet people like themselves who've lived so long with diabetes, but they also are in a study. We're going to be talking to JDRF's CEO about their part in this new effort for nonprofit insulin. There's a company that is going to be manufacturing, producing, selling its own insulin. And we're going to find out a lot more about that and JDRF's role in it and much more coming up. Tandem's Bolus by Phone. We've got them coming on. So stay tuned. Lots of fun stuff coming on. So I'll see you back here soon. I'm Stacey Sims. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.